The sound of gunfire shattered the morning calm. 3 sharp cracks, echoing off courthouse walls, sent people diving for cover, papers flying like startled birds. I hit the marble floor before my mind caught up with the noise. Pain burned through my shoulder, hot and blinding. My ears rang, my breath came in ragged gasps. Somewhere above the chaos, someone screamed, "Shots fired! Shots fired!" I was the target. Judge David Hart, 48 years old, sworn to uphold the law, bleeding on the courthouse steps. Through the haze, I saw her. HOA Karen. The woman whose name had haunted my docket for months. The self-proclaimed community protector, who turned neighbors into enemies and homeowners into prisoners of her rules. Her face was calm, almost serene. She didn't run. She just stood there with the gun still in her hand, smoke rising from the barrel as sirens began to wail in the distance. "Drop the weapon," an officer shouted, but Karen didn't flinch. She turned, placed the gun gently on the ground, and raised her hands. Her lips moved, not an apology, but something else. I couldn't hear it over the ringing in my ears, but I knew what it was. A smile. Minutes later, I was being rushed to the ER, my vision blurring, the world spinning. I remember gripping the paramedic's wrist, forcing the words out through the pain. "Don't let her walk free." But as they wheeled me through the double doors, I heard something over the radio that made my blood run cold. Suspect has surrendered and is walking into court on her own accord. Walking into my courtroom, the same place where, just hours earlier, I'd sentenced her to lose everything, and now she'd come back to finish the trial, or finish me. That morning had started like every other. Quiet coffee, a dark suit, and the slow hum of the courthouse elevator carrying me to the second floor. On my desk waited the thickest case file of the year, the Willowgate HOA Residents Association, presided over by one Karen Delancey. Locals called her HOA Karen long before she ever stood before my bench. She'd fined an elderly veteran for flying his flag too early, sued a single mother over a flowerbed color violation, and demanded children be banned from using the community pool after 6 p.m. The homeowners had finally rebelled. Hiring counsel to dissolve her presidency, I was assigned to oversee the injunction, a simple civil matter until it became personal. Karen was intelligent, meticulous, and frighteningly composed in court. But beneath the polite tone, I could feel the heat of obsession. She didn't just enforce rules, she worshipped them. She viewed the HOA charter like scripture, herself as its prophet. When the residents presented videos, photographs, and petitions proving years of harassment, I saw something break behind her eyes. It was small, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, the kind that comes when control begins to slip. "Ms. Delancey," I said during closing statements, "the community no longer recognizes your authority. Effective immediately, the HOA board is suspended pending investigation." She didn't blink, didn't breathe, just whispered, "You've made a mistake, Your Honor." That voice lingered even as the bailiff escorted her out. Later that evening, my clerk found a letter on the courtroom steps addressed to me. It was handwritten, perfectly neat. When you destroy order, chaos follows. And chaos bleeds! I dismissed it as another angry rant. Judges receive threats all the time. Still, something about that phrasing made the hair on my neck stand up. The next morning, she didn't show up for her scheduled appeal filing. The courthouse felt unusually still, the air heavy like before a storm, and when I stepped outside for a breath before the next hearing, the world exploded in gunfire. Now, as I lay in the hospital, replaying every warning sign I'd ignored, I realized something chilling. Karen's plan hadn't ended with revenge. It had just begun. Because when she walked into that courtroom after shooting me, she wasn't there to confess. She was there to justify. The first time I saw the rage in Karen Delancey's eyes was 2 weeks before the shooting. It was during a hearing packed with homeowners, tired faces, crossed arms, all whispering under their breath. Karen stood at the defendant's table, her HOA badge pinned perfectly to her blazer like it was a military medal. She spoke with the arrogance of someone who'd never been challenged before. "Your Honor," she said, her voice slicing through the murmurs. "This neighborhood has fallen apart because people think rules don't matter." "I am restoring order," I leaned forward. "By finding a man for planting sunflowers?" Her eyes flickered. "By enforcing standards." There was something chilling about her calmness, a kind of righteousness that felt unstable. When the resident's lawyer presented evidence of her harassment, security footage of her yelling at children, late-night letters threatening eviction over noise violations that didn't exist, she didn't flinch. She just smiled and said, "Order always offends the chaotic." The courtroom buzzed. Even my bailiff shifted uneasily. At the end of that day, I gave my ruling, effective immediately. Ms. Delancey is prohibited from representing the HOA or issuing any citations pending full investigation. Karen stood still for several seconds. Then she leaned across the table, eyes locked on mine. "You think you're protecting them?" she whispered, voice so low only I could hear. "But you're protecting rot. When people stop fearing the law, they start needing it in blood." The bailiff moved in, but she didn't resist. She gathered her papers, turned her back, and left the courtroom, heels striking the marble like clock ticks. 2 days later, my chambers received an envelope. Inside, a single spent bullet casing and a typed note. 1 down. 2 to go. My staff panicked. Police were notified. I told them to increase security, but secretly, I hoped it was just a scare tactic. It wasn't. Because while I sat behind locked doors reviewing motions, Karen was at a firing range outside town, learning how to make her promise real. And when she'd practiced enough to hit a moving target at 20 yards, she signed the range logbook with a single line: "Order restored soon." In the weeks following the suspension of the HOA board, the community began to breathe again. The lawns once ruled by fear sprouted color: flags, flower beds, laughter. Children rode bikes past driveways that used to echo with Karen's threats. It should have been peace. But peace, to Karen, was humiliation. From her window, she watched it all. The neighbors who had once bowed their heads now waving to each other. The mailboxes she'd once controlled now plastered with flyers demanding new leadership. Every smile outside her window was an insult. Every garden decoration a declaration of rebellion. Her power had been revoked by one person: me. The judge who, in her eyes, had destroyed order. That's when the letters began. Anonymous envelopes, postmarked from neighboring towns, sent to residents who'd testified against her. "You think the judge will protect you forever?" One read. "Laws change. Bullets don't." The police traced the messages to a rented P.O. box under a false name: Catherine Lane, Karen's middle name. But what really sealed her dissent came a week before the shooting. She attended an HOA dissolution meeting uninvited, storming into the hall while residents voted to permanently remove her from the community council. Her voice was trembling, not weak, but trembling with fury barely contained. "You think replacing rules with chaos makes you free?" she shouted. "When this place burns, you'll beg for someone like me again." Security escorted her out, but the damage was done. Every news outlet picked up the story. Former HOA president melts down in public meeting. That same night, my court clerk forwarded me a social media post. It was Karen's official HOA page. Though the board had been dissolved, she still had access to it. Her last post read, "Some laws are written on paper. Others are written in blood. Tomorrow we'll see which ones matter." I forwarded it to law enforcement immediately. They promised extra patrols. But no one could have known what tomorrow meant. The next morning, I left home early, an hour before hearings began. The courthouse steps gleamed with sunlight. It felt like an ordinary day. Until the moment I heard that first gunshot. The first bullet hit the marble column inches from my head. The second tore through my jacket sleeve. The third, the one she meant to kill with, buried itself in my shoulder, sending me spinning to the ground in a blur of sound and light. I remember the sharp metallic taste in my mouth, the scream of sirens somewhere distant, and the slow realization that I wasn't dead. Not yet. Karen stood 20 feet away at the base of the courthouse steps, her arm extended, the gun steady in her grasp like she'd rehearsed it. Her face wasn't twisted with rage or panic. It was calm, composed, like she was fulfilling a duty. Officers on security detail rushed toward her, weapons drawn. "Drop the gun, Ms. Delancey." But she didn't run, didn't even blink. She lowered the weapon gently, placed it on the concrete, and raised her hands. "Finally," she said, her voice eerily steady. "Justice listens." They cuffed her without resistance. She even smiled at the officers, as if she were the one doing them a favor. As they pulled her away, I lay bleeding on the courthouse steps, whispering through clenched teeth. "Why, Karen?" She looked back once, her eyes glinting under the morning sun. "Because you silenced order. Now chaos has a voice. After surgery, I learned the bullet had missed my heart by less than an inch. The doctors called it a miracle. I called it unfinished business." From my hospital bed, I followed the case updates. Karen had refused a lawyer, insisting she'd represent herself. As a citizen defending order against corruption, she wasn't pleading insanity. She was pleading purpose. The next hearing was set for 3 days later, the same courtroom she'd stood in when I'd ruled against her, and to everyone's shock, she refused bail and requested to attend her arraignment in person. I watched the footage on TV. Karen walking into the courthouse, wrists cuffed, chin high, flanked by armed deputies. Reporters swarmed her with questions. But she said only one thing before entering. Order always demands a sacrifice. Even bleeding and stitched. I knew what that meant. She hadn't fired those bullets to escape justice. She'd fired them to make justice her way, and now she was coming back to finish what the gun had started. With words. 3 days after the shooting, the courthouse looked like a war zone that had been scrubbed clean. The cracks patched, the blood washed away, the flags at half-mast. Reporters lined the steps like vultures. Inside, metal detectors whined and officers stood shoulder to shoulder, scanning every shadow. I wasn't supposed to be there. The doctors had ordered rest. The police had warned me, but I couldn't stay home, not while the woman who'd tried to kill me was about to speak in my courtroom. When the bailiff opened the side door, the whispers began. I stepped in, arm in a sling, bandage peeking from under my suit. Every camera turned toward me. Karen was already seated at the defense table, wearing county orange like it was a badge of honor. Her hair was tied back neatly, her expression unreadable. When she saw me, her lips curved, not in surprise, but in satisfaction. "Your Honor," she said before I could even sit, "you're alive." Her tone was casual, almost congratulatory. "I am," I replied, lowering myself into the seat. "Which means the law still stands." The courtroom erupted in murmurs. The prosecutor rose, voice tense. "Your Honor, this woman fired 3 rounds at you in broad daylight. This is not a debate. This is attempted murder." Karen stood, chains clinking. "No, it was a demonstration." Gasps rippled through the audience. She looked directly at me. "You silenced order, Judge Hart. You made the law a puppet for weak people. I wanted you to feel what happens when order collapses. That pain in your shoulder? That's what justice feels like when it bleeds." Her words cut through the room like glass. I should have been furious. Instead, what I felt was something colder. Clarity. Karen wasn't insane. She was methodical. She'd convinced herself that the shooting was not revenge but symbolism. That in wounding me, she had restored balance. I leaned forward. "Ms. Delancey, you misunderstand justice. It's not about fear." She tilted her head, smiling faintly. "Then why did it take bullets for you to listen?" The prosecutor slammed his hand on the table. "Enough! Your Honor, this defendant is dangerous, delusional, and unrepentant." I raised a hand. "Let her speak. Sometimes the guilty hang themselves with their own words." Karen's smile faltered for the first time, because she could see it. I wasn't afraid anymore. I'd come not as a victim, but as the embodiment of the one thing she couldn't manipulate, truth under oath. That was the moment the balance shifted. She'd tried to break the law by violence. Now she'd face the one weapon she couldn't control, the very system she thought she ruled, and when her trial began, it wouldn't just expose her madness. It would expose everyone who helped her feed it. The trial of State versus Karen Delancey began under flashing lights and camera lenses that turned the courthouse into a theater. Reporters called it the trial that shot the law itself. For the first time in my career, I wasn't presiding behind the bench. I was testifying in front of it. The courtroom felt smaller from this side, the air thicker. Every creak of wood echoed like a heartbeat. Karen sat at the defense table in an orange jumpsuit, her posture perfect, her hands folded like she was attending church. She refused counsel again, insisting on representing herself. "Your Honor," she said with that same infuriating composure, "I will not deny firing the weapon. I will only explain why." Her voice carried through the courtroom, clear and cold. "Judges like him," she pointed toward me, "destroy the backbone of order. They favor feelings over rules, excuses over accountability. I was simply enforcing what this country forgot: discipline." Her words sent a chill through the room. Some people even nodded quietly. Those who saw themselves in her defiance, those who feared a world without control. When it was my turn to speak, I took the stand and looked directly at her. "You talk about order," I said. "But order without compassion isn't justice. It's tyranny," Karen smirked, spoken like a man who's never been ignored. "I was the only one holding that neighborhood together. The minute you stripped me of power, people stopped paying dues, stopped caring, stopped obeying. You turned them into rebels, and rebels need punishment." "Punishment?" I repeated. "That's all you ever knew." She stood trembling, not with fear but emotion. "I gave them peace. I kept children safe, lawns trimmed, property values high. You call that tyranny?" The prosecutor rose. "You shot a man 3 times because he disagreed with you." Her voice cracked for the first time. "Because he silenced me." That echo hung in the courtroom like thunder. The prosecutor's next move was brutal. He approached with a clear evidence bag and set it on the table. Inside, the single bullet casing from the letter she'd mailed to my chambers weeks before the attack. "Exhibit C," he said. "Premeditation." Karen froze. Her composure shattered for the first time. "That wasn't a threat," she stammered. "It was a warning." The prosecutor stepped closer. "You call it a warning. We call it confession." Silence. Her breathing quickened. Her hands shook. "I didn't mean to kill him," she whispered. "Just to make him understand." But the jury wasn't moved. The video surveillance, the letters, the shooting range logs, all painted one truth. Karen Delancey had planned the attack for weeks, down to the exact courthouse entrance. As the prosecutor rested his case, Karen slumped into her chair. The pride, the posture, the steel in her eyes, gone. What sat before me now wasn't the HOA queen of Willowgate. It was a woman consumed by the lie that control was the same as justice. When the judge adjourned for recess, I looked at her one last time. She didn't meet my eyes. She just whispered something under her breath, 3 words that chilled me to the bone. "Chaos wins again." That was the moment I realized something terrifying. Karen hadn't lost her faith in order. She'd lost her faith in people, and that made her far more dangerous than any bullet ever could. When the court adjourned that day, it felt like the world itself needed a breath. The cameras stopped flashing. The crowd spilled into the marble halls, and yet inside, the silence was heavy, like something sacred had cracked. Karen was taken back to holding, but the sound of her chains against the tile lingered in everyone's ears. Even the officers avoided looking at her. There was no more arrogance in her stride, only emptiness, the hollow calm of a woman who had lost the meaning of her own crusade. Outside, the courthouse steps were crowded with reporters. "Judge Hart," one shouted as I exited, sling still on my arm. "Do you believe she's insane?" I paused. "No," I said softly. "She's just what happens when authority forgets empathy." That line would run on every network for days. But what they didn't show were the nights that followed, the nightmares, that dragged me back to the sound of gunfire, the smell of gunpowder and marble dust, the memory of her eyes as she aimed down the sight. Every time I closed mine, I saw her finger tighten. The shockwaves spread beyond me. The Willowgate neighborhood went into disarray. Without Karen's grip, years of pent-up anger erupted. Neighbors fought, Fences came down, lawsuits flew like confetti. The very chaos she'd claimed to prevent was now consuming the community she'd ruled. It was almost poetic, if it hadn't been so tragic. A week later, I received a letter at my office. No name, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper. You were right. I lost faith in people. But tell me, have you lost faith in justice? The handwriting was unmistakable. Karen's. I didn't respond, but I couldn't stop reading that one line over and over, feeling the unease it carried. She wasn't taunting me anymore. She was questioning herself. Then came the news. Karen had requested to testify at her own sentencing. Not to fight, not to appeal, but to set the record straight. Everyone assumed it would be another rant, another sermon on order and chaos. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. Because for the first time since the shooting, I sensed remorse in her silence. And if that was true, if Karen Delancey, the woman who once declared herself the embodiment of law, had finally broken, then the sentencing wouldn't just end her trial, it would reveal what the gunfire had really been about all along. Karen's request to speak at her sentencing sent the courthouse into lockdown. Every hallway hummed with armed presence. The detectives who had handled the shooting were there too, grim-faced, tired, and still uneasy about how easily she'd walked through their hands that morning. Detective Ramos, the lead investigator, met me in the corridor before the hearing. We rechecked everything, he said. Gun license, range logs, even her storage locker. She'd been planning this for months. No accomplices, no manifesto, just a belief she was doing the right thing. He handed me a folder. Inside were photos, her notebooks filled with HOA bylaws, sections highlighted in red, scribbles that read, "Law decays when emotion governs." She wasn't insane, Ramos said quietly. She was obsessed with being right. In the hearing room, Karen entered in shackles. The press filled every seat. For the first time, she didn't look like the neighborhood tyrant or the self-appointed savior. She looked human, pale, tired. The prosecutor summarized the evidence: premeditation, letters, the shell casing. Nothing new. The judge nodded, then turned to her. "Ms. Delancey, you requested to address the court." "You may speak." Karen rose slowly. "I was raised to believe order was love," she began. "My father was a police officer. My mother ran the HOA. They told me people only behave when they're afraid to break rules. I carried that lesson like scripture." Her eyes lifted toward me. "When you stripped that away, I thought you were killing the only truth I had left. So I fought back the only way I knew how." She paused, voice shaking now. "But when I saw you stand up after I shot you, when I realized you survived, I understood something. Order isn't power. It's mercy. And I don't have any." No one spoke. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. The judge cleared his throat. "Do you have anything else to say before sentencing?" Karen looked down. "Yes, I'm sorry. Not because I was caught. Because I finally see the difference between fear and respect." The bailiff led her away. For the first time, she didn't resist. Detective Ramos leaned toward me as the doors closed. "You think she means it?" I watched her disappear down the hallway, orange fabric flickering under the fluorescence. "I think," I said softly, "she finally met the law she pretended to serve." Outside, rain began to fall, slow, steady, cleansing. The day of sentencing arrived under gray skies. The courthouse, still scarred from that morning's gunfire weeks ago, stood wrapped in silence. Reporters waited beyond the barricades, their lenses ready to capture the ending of a story that had started in blood and disbelief. Inside, the courtroom was filled to capacity. Officers, victims of HOA abuse, even former residents of Willow Gate who had once feared Karen. They sat shoulder to shoulder, united now by the strange curiosity of watching a woman who'd once ruled their lives face judgment she could no longer escape. I sat quietly in the front row, bandaged arm resting in a sling. The bullet wound had healed, but the ache in my chest hadn't. When Karen entered, the crowd murmured. She was thinner now, her arrogance gone. The orange jumpsuit hung loosely from her frame. Yet her chin was still high, an echo of the woman she used to be. The presiding judge read the charges aloud. Attempted murder, assault with a deadly weapon, unlawful possession of a firearm, and obstruction of justice. Each word landed like a hammer strike. Then the judge turned to her. "Ms. Delancey, you may make a final statement before sentencing." Karen rose, her voice low, steady. "I thought law was about control," she began. "I thought people obeyed because they feared punishment. I see now that fear isn't order, it's decay. When I shot Judge Hart, I wasn't punishing him. I was punishing every part of myself that couldn't live without control." Her hands trembled on the table. "I wanted to be the law. Instead, I broke it." The courtroom was still. You could hear the buzz of the overhead lights. She looked directly at me. "Your Honor." "I mean, Judge Hart, you were supposed to die that day. When you didn't, I realized something terrifying. Justice doesn't die when you hurt a man. It dies when you convince yourself you are it." "For the first time," she cried. The presiding judge leaned forward. "And what do you believe justice means now, Ms. Delancey?" Karen wiped her tears, her voice breaking. "It means accepting that I don't get to decide anymore." The judge nodded once. "Then this court will decide for you." He raised his gavel. "Ms. Delancey, you are sentenced to 25 years in state prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 15. You will also undergo mandatory psychiatric evaluation and rehabilitation. The court hopes one day you'll learn what true order feels like. Peace." The gavel fell. Karen didn't resist as deputies took her arms. But before they let her out, she turned toward me. "Judge Hart," she whispered, "thank you for surviving." For a moment, I didn't know whether she meant it as remorse or irony. Then she added softly, "If I'd succeeded, I'd still believe I was right." The officers led her away. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, half relief, half disbelief. Outside, the rain that had begun earlier turned into a downpour. Washing across the courthouse steps, the same stone where blood had once spread beneath my hand, and as I watched it flow into the drains, I realized the truth of what she said. Justice isn't something you pronounce. It's something you survive long enough to understand. The echo of the gavel still rang in my head long after the courtroom emptied. 25 years. It should have felt like closure. Justice delivered, balance restored. But as the crowd dispersed and the cameras shut off, all I felt was silence. Heavy, complicated silence. I stayed behind, sitting alone on the same bench where she'd once stood to defend the indefensible. The rain outside tapped against the high windows like quiet applause from the heavens, steady, unrelenting, cleansing. The bailiff returned a few minutes later. "Judge," he said carefully, "she asked to see you." "Just for a moment." "She says it's important." Part of me wanted to refuse. The other part, the one that couldn't stand to leave a question unanswered, said, "Bring her in." They escorted her in shackles, her wrists raw from the cuffs, her face wet. Whether from tears or rain, I couldn't tell. She looked different now, smaller, human. "Judge Hart," she said softly, "I don't expect forgiveness. I just need you to understand something before they take me." I didn't speak. "When I pulled that trigger," she continued, "I thought I was protecting the law. But what I really wanted was for someone to stop me. You did. Not with bullets. With survival." She stepped closer, chains clinking. "You're still alive, and that means everything I believed about fear keeping order was wrong. Maybe the world doesn't need people like me anymore." Her words cracked halfway through. I exhaled slowly. "The world never needed people like you, Karen, but maybe it needed your fall, so others could see what blind order looks like." She gave a sad smile. "That's justice, then." "Not punishment, illumination." The guards motioned to lead her out, but she turned one last time. "You know what I envied most about you, Judge?" I shook my head. "You believed in mercy. I never could." Then she was gone. The door closed behind her with a metallic thud that felt final, the sound of one chapter ending, another beginning. Outside, thunder rolled faintly in the distance. I walked to the window, looking out at the courthouse steps where it had all begun, the place I'd almost died, and she'd lost her mind. The stone was wet, shining under streetlights. The blood was gone, but the memory remained. Justice had been served. but not the kind that satisfies. The kind that humbles. And for the first time in my life, I understood something no textbook ever taught. Justice doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just breathes, quietly, painfully, and alive. Months passed. The courthouse finally returned to its rhythm. Gavel strikes, quiet verdicts, murmurs of the public filing in and out like the tide. But for me, nothing was the same. Every echo down the marble hallways still carried the faint memory of 3 gunshots, of smoke rising in sunlight, of a woman who mistook fear for justice. I stayed on the bench, though, not out of pride but purpose. Each ruling now felt heavier. Every sentence, every fine, every order delivered with the reminder that law isn't about control. It's about humanity holding itself accountable. Karen Delancey was transferred to the state correctional facility up north. I never saw her again, but every few weeks a letter would arrive in precise, slanted handwriting. "The noise here is constant," one read, "but I hear peace between the hours." "I spend my days teaching other inmates about the HOA codes," another said, almost humor in its madness. "Turns out some rules are good for us after all. And the last one, the one that came a year later, you were right. Mercy isn't weakness. It's order's only hope. I hope you've found peace." "I think I finally have." No signature, just her prison ID. That letter stayed in my desk drawer, not as a reminder of the attack, but as proof that even the most broken minds could learn clarity when stripped of power. On the anniversary of the shooting, I visited the courthouse steps for the first time since that morning. The city had repaired everything, new glass, new marble. No one walking past would ever know what had happened there. But I remembered. The air was warm, the trees whispering in the breeze. I placed my hand on the column that had taken the first bullet and whispered quietly, "Order restored, Karen. The right way this time." As I turned to leave, I caught my reflection in the glass doors. Not as a victim, not even as a survivor, just a man who had finally learned what justice really meant. Justice wasn't the gavel or the verdict. It wasn't the uniform or the courtroom or the headlines. Justice was standing in the sunlight, breathing, and still choosing compassion over vengeance. The courthouse bell rang behind me. Sharp. Clear, final. I smiled faintly, buttoned my coat, and walked away from the building that had once been painted in smoke and blood. For the first time in a long time, I felt peace, not because order had returned, but because I had.